One of the most famous motorcycles ever built just got banned from sale. No recalls, no safety defects, no mechanical failures. Sound familiar? It should, because this same story has been playing out for decades. What if I told you that one of the cleanest motorcycles ever built was banned not because it failed, but because it succeeded too well? And what if I told you a decision made in the 1980s is still being used to kill motorcycles today? Back then, Yamaha achieved what many considered impossible. They created a two-stroke motorcycle that didn't just meet California's brutal emission standards, it crushed them. The RZ350 became the first production motorcycle in United States history to roll off the line with catalytic converters. It was cleaner than most motorcycles of its era. Yet just 2 years after its triumphant debut, this engineering marvel vanished from American showrooms forever. No recalls, no mechanical failures, no safety defects, just gone. The question isn't why the RZ350 failed. The question is, why was success not enough? Let's go back to 1984. Reagan's America. Motorcycle manufacturers were locked in a bitter horsepower war. The Yamaha RZ350, with its 347cc liquid-cooled parallel twin engine, challenged expectations and reshaped the perception of what a street-legal two-stroke could be. This wasn't just another smoky, oil-burning relic of motorcycling's past. The RZ350 packed Yamaha's revolutionary power valve system, also known as YPVS, a variable exhaust port technology that did something previously thought impossible. It gave riders explosive high RPM power while maintaining civilized low-end manners, all without choking bystanders in a cloud of blue smoke. But here's where the story gets interesting. While other manufacturers were content building dirty, loud two-strokes that regulators were itching to ban, Yamaha saw the writing on the wall. They didn't just meet emissions requirements, they obliterated them. The RZ350 arrived in California showrooms equipped with not one, but 2 catalytic converters, plus an air injection system that would make contemporary cars jealous. California in the 1980s wasn't just a state, it was the emissions battlefield that would determine the future of American motorcycling. The California Air Resources Board had drawn a line in the sand: clean up or get out. So Yamaha called their bluff. The RZ350 didn't just pass CARB's stringent requirements, it made them look easy. Here was a two-stroke that delivered the raw, addictive power that made riders fall in love with the engine type. Wrapped in emissions technology so advanced, it wouldn't look out of place on motorcycles built decades later. The result? A bike that was simultaneously the future of motorcycling and a dead end. Here's what no one tells you about the RZ350's demise. It wasn't killed by failure, it was murdered by bureaucracy. After dominating California's emissions tests for 2 solid years, after proving that clean two-strokes weren't just possible but practical, after showing the world that environmental responsibility and riding excitement could coexist, CARB made a decision that would echo through motorcycling history. They simply refused to renew the bike's exemption. No explanation, no technical justification, no claims of inadequate performance. The RZ350 had become too successful at proving regulators wrong, and for that crime, it received a death sentence. Think the RZ350's story is just about one motorcycle? Think again. This wasn't the end of a single model, it was the birth of a new reality where bureaucrats, not engineers, decide what innovations reach your driveway. The RZ350's execution established a chilling precedent. No matter how clean, how advanced, or how successful your technology becomes, regulatory approval can be revoked on a whim. The question that should keep every rider awake at night: if they could kill the cleanest two-stroke ever built for no reason, what's next? Today, as electric motorcycles face similar regulatory uncertainty and internal combustion engines live under constant threat of prohibition, the RZ350's ghost haunts every showroom. It stands as proof that in the modern era, innovation means nothing without political protection. The Yamaha RZ350 didn't just die in 1986. It took the promise of clean two-stroke technology with it, leaving us to wonder, what other revolutionary motorcycles have we lost, not to market forces or technical limitations, but to the arbitrary whims of unelected officials? The next time someone tells you that motorcycles are getting cleaner and more advanced, remember the RZ350. Remember that we once had a bike that solved the emissions puzzle 30 years ago, and remember how quickly innovation can be erased when it threatens the wrong people. Some victories are too dangerous to be allowed to survive. That move didn't just stop future sales. It effectively ended the RZ350's life in the US altogether. Yamaha pulled the model from its lineup, and no direct replacement came to market. It was the last two-stroke street bike Yamaha would sell in America. The irony couldn't have been more striking. The most emissions-conscious two-stroke ever mass-produced was also the first to be pushed out on environmental grounds. Across the rest of the country, riders could still purchase the RZ350, at least temporarily. But California set a precedent, and the growing influence of CARB standards began to extend beyond state lines. As the Environmental Protection Agency adopted tighter federal rules, two-stroke engines fell out of favor, not because they failed mechanically or performed poorly, but because their emissions profile, no matter how controlled, did not align with new political priorities. The RZ350's short run turned it into something of a myth. Collectors began scooping them up in the early 1990s. Their power-to-weight ratio was exceptional, and their responsiveness was unmatched in their displacement class. Meanwhile, riders in California who had bought them legally in the mid-80s started facing registration difficulties. Some couldn't renew tags without proof of continued emissions compliance, which wasn't available for a discontinued model. Others were reclassified under DMV policies as off-road only, despite having all road legal equipment and documentation. Today, federal law still allows importation of the RZ350 under the 25-year exemption rule. But even with federal approval, registering one in California is nearly impossible. The DMV won't process titles for most two-stroke imports unless they were registered in-state before the cutoff, and emissions waivers are nearly impossible to secure for vintage motorcycles without substantial documentation and testing costs that few individual owners can justify. In practice, the RZ350 is legal on paper and illegal in operation. In some states, owners have been told their bike cannot be operated on public roads, despite holding valid out-of-state titles and full compliance with the Imported Vehicle Safety Compliance Act of 1988. This wasn't just bureaucratic slowness. It was a quiet but effective policy reversal, one that signaled how environmental regulation could be applied with retroactive consequences. The RZ350 didn't stop working. It didn't fail crash tests or cause pedestrian deaths. It simply no longer fits the evolving narrative of acceptable road-going machines. And it would not be the last motorcycle to experience this. What began with California's 2-year limit on a two-stroke with emissions controls would spread into a wider trend of non-legislated, paperwork-driven suppression. By the late 1980s, the regulatory landscape that had quietly sidelined the RZ350 began to harden. The California Air Resources Board had already made its stance clear by refusing to renew Yamaha's emissions exemption. And while federal law had not yet banned two-stroke motorcycles outright, the writing was on the wall. California's decisions often served as a template for other states, especially when it came to environmental policy. As emissions control became a political and regulatory priority, manufacturers saw the risks of continuing to produce machines that skirted the line, even those as advanced as the RZ350. The decision not to renew the RZ350's exemption was not based on new data showing the motorcycle was polluting excessively. Yamaha had gone further than any other manufacturer at the time to make a two-stroke clean enough for road use. But the emissions debate was shifting from what could be controlled to what could be eliminated. Two-strokes were increasingly viewed as outdated, no matter how much technology they included. Public agencies were under pressure to phase them out in favor of cleaner-burning four-stroke alternatives, which were easier to regulate and more in line with automotive standards. When Yamaha pulled the RZ350 from the US market after 1986, the company made no official announcement linking the decision to regulatory failure, but industry observers and riders alike understood the context. Without California, a major motorcycle market, the financial case for continuing production was weak. And with the Environmental Protection Agency introducing stricter standards for hydrocarbon and nitrogen oxide emissions, the RZ350's future in the broader US market was already uncertain. While technically legal for sale outside of California in 1987, Yamaha had seen the horizon and made a quiet exit. What followed was a gradual, policy-driven erasure of the RZ350 from American roads. The bike was never recalled. No safety notice was issued. But in state after state, new registrations for RZ350s became harder to secure. Emissions rules tightened. DMV procedures changed. In some cases, existing registrations were allowed to continue under grandfather clauses. But if a bike changed hands or was brought in from out of state, many owners found themselves in regulatory limbo. In California, riders who had legally purchased and registered RZ350s in the mid-1980s sometimes discovered, years later, that they could no longer renew their plates. New emissions documentation was now required, documentation that Yamaha no longer provided, and that the DMV did not recognize for older, discontinued models. Even when the bikes were in pristine condition, with original emissions equipment still intact, the bureaucratic hurdles made continued legal use nearly impossible. Elsewhere, the barriers were less direct, but no less effective. In New York, emissions inspection requirements for motorcycles vary by county. While not explicitly banning the RZ350, certain counties enforced rules that effectively disqualified older two-strokes from passing inspection. In some cases, DMV clerks unfamiliar with the RZ350's exemption status simply rejected paperwork out of caution, unwilling to risk approving a bike that might trigger legal scrutiny. For riders attempting to import RZ350 under the 25-year rule, the challenges grew even more tangled. Federally, the Imported Vehicle Safety Compliance Act of 1988 allows vehicles over 25 years old to be exempt from certain emissions and safety requirements. But state DMVs are not obligated to accept those exemptions automatically. In California, especially, the CARB framework supersedes federal exemptions when it comes to emissions. This means a two-stroke motorcycle legally imported and titled under federal law can still be denied registration at the state level. This gray zone has caught many owners off guard. Some spend thousands of dollars acquiring an RZ350 through legal import channels, only to find they cannot register or insure the bike in their home state. Even if another state issues a title, bringing that bike into California or a CARB-compliant state for use on public roads often results in denial. And once denied, that bike may be reclassified as an off-road vehicle, regardless of whether it was ever designed or used that way. These classification changes are not merely bureaucratic. They alter a vehicle's insurability, its resale value, and in many cases, its legal status in the eyes of traffic enforcement. A motorcycle that once bore a clean street title might now be restricted to private property or trail use, even if it is in better mechanical condition than many older vehicles still legally on the road. The inconsistency is where the frustration begins to grow. In states like Arizona and Texas, RZ350 are still regularly titled and ridden. Owners complete necessary forms, pass inspections, and ride without incident. But a rider moving from Texas to California may find their bike suddenly uninsurable, unregistrable, and essentially illegal, not because of mechanical issues, but because of shifting policy interpretations. And while modern motorcycles continue to evolve with cleaner, more efficient technologies, the enforcement history around the RZ350 shows that legal compliance is not always enough. The motorcycle was compliant when it was released. It introduced emissions features no other bike had, and yet it was erased through a combination of state-level policy, agency discretion, and administrative silence. What this illustrates is the growing power of non-legislated policy enforcement. There was no bill debated on the floor of the California State Assembly banning the RZ350. No federal law passed in Washington declared it unfit. The bike was removed through guidance documents, emissions thresholds, and registration criteria that shifted over time, often without public input or rider awareness. For many owners, that absence of formal process is what stings the most. They did everything right, followed the law, maintained their bikes, and respected regulations. Yet they woke up to letters denying renewal or DMV staff informing them their vehicles could no longer be registered. No scandal, no recall, just a quiet, administrative exit. The RZ350's disappearance from American roads wasn't just a matter of compliance. It was a matter of classification, discretion, and regulatory inertia. And as more vehicles, especially vintage imports, fall under the scrutiny of evolving emission standards, the question grows larger than one motorcycle. If a fully legal, factory-equipped, emissions-conscious machine can be written out of the system, what other machines are next? And who decides, without a vote or public hearing, what stays and what disappears from our roads? For those who owned the Yamaha RZ350 in the years after its disappearance from showroom floors, the bike became more than a machine, it became a commitment. Owners joined a growing number of riders across the country who were determined to keep the two-stroke icon alive, both on the streets and in the collective memory of American motorcycling. What followed was not just a technical battle over emissions or parts, it became a long and often frustrating administrative fight as owners tried to navigate a system that seemed built to quietly push their motorcycles off the road. Online forums became lifelines. Communities such as Two Stroke World, RZRD 500, and the Vintage Yamaha Yahoo groups hosted long-running threads on how to legally maintain, register, and insure RZ350 in different states. Riders shared scans of Department of Motor Vehicles paperwork, step-by-step guides for titling vintage imports, and warnings about which states had begun rejecting two-stroke applications without notice. For many, the bikes still ran perfectly, but getting a plate or renewing one became a yearly gamble, especially in emissions-restricted states like California, New York, and New Jersey. Some tried legal workarounds. Riders in states with stricter rules began registering their bikes in states like Arizona or Montana, which were more lenient with vintage motorcycles. In some cases, owners would use out-of-state addresses, register their bikes there, and then bring them into their home state under dual residency or temporary plate allowances. For a while, this loophole allowed continued road use, even in places like California. But Department of Motor Vehicles offices eventually began cracking down, questioning whether these out-of-state registrations were valid under the owner's declared residency. Even more frustrating was the inconsistency. Riders in one California county could renew their plate without issue, while someone in the next county over was denied outright. Some were told their bike would be reclassified as off-road only, despite already having a clean title and history of legal registration. Others were required to submit emissions documentation that no longer existed, or to prove factory compliance with regulations that had changed multiple times since the bike was first produced. For riders importing bikes from abroad, the situation was even more precarious. The RZ350 was available in several international variants, many of which offered improved performance over the US version. These models, especially the European and Japanese editions, were legally eligible for import under the 25-year exemption rule, and owners often followed every legal step. Customs declarations, U.S. Department of Transportation exemption forms, Environmental Protection Agency waivers, and detailed shipping documentation. Yet even with full federal compliance, many found themselves blocked at the state level. Their bikes were either denied title or flagged as non-conforming based on visual inspection alone. Some Department of Motor Vehicles offices rejected these motorcycles on the grounds that their frames lacked a U.S.-style compliance label, even when import documentation confirmed their legal status. Others were denied because they were never sold in the United States, which is not a valid legal reason under federal rules, but is still cited in practice by underinformed or cautious clerks. Appeals were difficult. State vehicle codes are not always clear on how to handle vintage or gray market motorcycles, and most DMV offices operate with limited discretion and little incentive to process complex cases. As frustration grew, riders began organizing. A small number of owners filed complaints with state attorneys general. Others reached out to local representatives or legislative aides, asking why their legally owned and imported bikes were being refused registration. But the answers they received often pointed to agency policy, not law. No statute had been passed to ban the RZ350. No regulatory body had issued a blanket prohibition. Instead, officials cited internal guidelines, emissions, classification charts, and AAMVA best practices as the basis for their decisions. The American Association of Motor Vehicle Administrators, a nonprofit group made up of DMV officials and policymakers from across North America, had begun circulating internal documents in the early 2010s, focused on how to handle imported and low-volume vehicles. While not law, these documents often influence how states interpret registration eligibility. In the absence of clear statutes, DMV officials leaned on these guidelines to justify reclassification of older two-strokes, including the RZ350, as off-road or non-conforming. This administrative strategy worked precisely because it avoided public scrutiny. There was no need for a public hearing, no floor vote, no signature from a governor. Decisions were made quietly through updated forms, staff memos, and procedural checklists. For owners caught in the middle, there was no clear path forward. Legal recourse was prohibitively expensive, especially for individuals dealing with a single motorcycle. And because these rejections were framed as procedural, not punitive, they rarely triggered media coverage or political attention. Despite all this, a dedicated group of owners continued to ride. In states where the RZ350 remained legal, rallies and meetups kept the spirit alive. Some owners adapted by converting their bikes into track-only machines, removing registration plates altogether and riding exclusively on closed circuits. Others transformed their RZ350 into display pieces, treating them as investments or museum-quality examples of a lost era in motorcycling history. And for those who were unwilling to let go, the path was simple: fight the paperwork, year after year. What united these riders was not just nostalgia or mechanical passion. It was a deep frustration with the way their rights as owners had been eroded, not through due process, but through institutional drift. They had followed the rules, filed the right forms, and played by the book. And still, their machines were quietly being boxed out of public roads by a system that did not offer them any meaningful voice. The Yamaha RZ350 was not a public safety risk. It was not an emissions outlaw by the standards of its time. In fact, it was one of the most progressive motorcycles of its generation, offering cleaner performance through factory-engineered emissions controls. The irony that this same motorcycle is now denied registration in the name of environmental policy is not lost on its owners. They do not deny the need for cleaner air or more efficient machines, but they question the fairness of a system that targets vintage, low-volume motorcycles while allowing far more polluting vehicles, often without catalytic converters or safety equipment, to remain fully street legal. As the movement around vintage two-strokes continues to grow, riders have begun documenting every registration denial, every DMV rejection, and every emissions exemption request denied without review. The goal is simple: create a record, push for transparency, and demand a standard that is consistent, legal, and fair. For the owners of the Yamaha RZ350, it is not just about riding a legendary machine. It is about protecting the right to ride it at all. For years, the issues surrounding the Yamaha RZ350 were seen as isolated. Riders affected by registration denials or reclassification quietly adjusted. Some parked their bikes permanently, some transitioned them to track use, and others fought silent battles at local DMV counters. But over time, the same administrative tactics used against the RZ350 began appearing in a broader pattern. What happened to that one motorcycle was no longer unique. It was a preview of something larger, a policy model for how older, imported, or non-conforming vehicles could be squeezed off public roads without changing a single law. The core mechanism behind this trend was not legislative action, but bureaucratic redefinition. Vehicles previously accepted under federal exemptions were being quietly reassessed by state agencies. DMV offices began relying more heavily on non-binding documents like best practice memos from organizations such as the American Association of Motor Vehicle Administrators. These documents, while advisory on paper, became practical policy in registration offices. Staff were told to apply specific criteria, such as emission classification or manufacturer origin, to decide what could be plated, even if the vehicles themselves met all the legal standards when first registered. In the case of the RZ350, this meant that owners holding titles for over 3 decades could suddenly find themselves ineligible to renew registration. In many states, there was no appeal process. Once a bike was marked as non-compliant or off-road only, the classification remained unless the owner could produce emission certification that no longer existed or prove a safety compliance that was never required when the vehicle was new. The burden of proof shifted entirely onto the rider. What made this even more concerning was how the precedent began to affect other motorcycles. Riders attempting to register vintage imports like the Suzuki RG500 Gamma, the Honda NSR 250, or the Kawasaki KR1S faced increasing resistance. These bikes, like the RZ350, were never officially sold in the United States, but became legal to import under the 25-year exemption rule. Owners followed the same procedures, filing with the U.S. Department of Transportation, completing Environmental Protection Agency declarations, and passing state inspections. And yet, in multiple states, these motorcycles were flagged at the final step. DMV staff rejected the registration, citing incomplete emissions documentation or vague designations like not for on-road use. Despite no federal law stating such a restriction, in California, the pattern became even more entrenched. Riders who brought in legal two-stroke motorcycles from out of state found themselves blocked at the final stage of paperwork, even when those bikes had legal titles elsewhere and had been used on public roads for years. California's DMV would often deny registration or issue plates marked for off-highway use only. The justification varied, sometimes referencing CARB emission standards, other times pointing to an absence of specific U.S. compliance labels. In either case, the decision was final. No appeal board, no public review, just a change in status based on administrative discretion. As more riders began to face these roadblocks, the conversation shifted from one of compliance to one of principle. Many owners started asking, if I followed every federal rule, paid all the required taxes, filed the paperwork, and received a legal title, how can the state later tell me I cannot ride? The answer often came down to what DMV offices considered public interest or state-level emissions integrity. In other words, the legal right to operate a vehicle could be withdrawn based on policy priorities, not on new violations or mechanical failures. This shift in administrative power has implications that go well beyond two-stroke motorcycles. Today, state agencies can reinterpret vehicle classifications, emissions rules, and safety guidelines at will, and then apply those reinterpretations retroactively. Owners of legally imported and legally titled vehicles are increasingly at risk of losing access to roads, not because they broke the law, but because a regulation or internal guideline changed after the fact. For the Yamaha RZ350, this is exactly what happened. It met the rules when it was new. It met the rules under the 25-year exemption. And still, in many states, it can no longer be used for its intended purpose. Some owners have begun seeking legal representation to challenge these practices. Others have attempted to rally community support to push for clear and consistent rules. A few have filed requests under the Freedom of Information Act to learn more about how DMV decisions are being made behind closed doors. These efforts have helped uncover internal memos, staff training documents, and correspondence between state agencies and external organizations like AAMVA or CARB. But changing policy through litigation or administrative appeal is slow, costly, and often inaccessible to the average rider. Meanwhile, the environmental arguments used to justify the bans continue to provoke debate. The RZ350, while a two-stroke, was designed with emissions control in mind, equipped with factory catalytic converters, and tuned to reduce visible smoke and hydrocarbon output. It was ahead of its time, and yet, under modern interpretation, it is treated as inherently polluting, regardless of its actual performance. This perspective ignores the reality that many legally registered classic vehicles, cars and trucks, built decades earlier with no emissions controls, are allowed on the road with historic plates and minimal oversight. What frustrates many riders most is not the desire for cleaner air or safer streets. It is the lack of consistency. They see electric motorcycles given generous regulatory pathways, even when they are imported without full Department of Transportation compliance. They see massive trucks, older SUVs, and high-displacement cruisers emitting far more than a properly maintained RZ350, yet never facing reclassification or registration rejection. The logic feels arbitrary, and in that arbitrariness lies the real danger. Not just to two-stroke enthusiasts, but to anyone who owns a vehicle outside the regulatory mainstream. The Yamaha RZ350 represents a specific case, but also a broader warning. It shows how policy shifts, even subtle ones, can strip legal rights from owners without ever passing through a legislative chamber. It shows how vehicles can be made illegal by memo, not law. And it shows how systems can evolve to prioritize control over clarity, denying riders their freedom not through outright bans, but through a slow tightening of the rules that most never get to see. For now, the RZ350 still exists, on tracks, in garages, and in collectors' hands. But its presence on public roads is fading, not because it failed the test of time, but because time was rewritten around it. The question now is whether this will remain an isolated injustice or become the template for future restrictions. Because if a motorcycle that once led the way in emissions, innovation can be shut out with no recourse, the door is open for many more to follow. And the roads we thought were ours may no longer be ours to use. With that, we have reached the end of today's video. If you have come this far with us, be sure to check out other videos on the channel.